Well, put aside AI for a moment. The traditional computer is really good at doing one thing and one thing only, and that's counting, and counting really, really fast. So why is it that now that we live in an age where computers are absolutely ubiquitous, we can't count the number of votes on election night until months have passed after the polls have closed? Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Ott. And gentlemen, let me play a small, little 15-second revolutionary clip from President-elect Donald Trump.
One of the things we're going to do is we've got to fix the election so that we get honest counts and they get done by 10 o'clock in the evening or something thereabouts. They have places where they're still counting votes.
Steve, let's start with you. Florida has, over the course of the last 20 years, been an interesting place to watch. It was a battleground state for many, many years. In the 2016, 2020, and 2024 elections, Florida, which is now, I think, the third most popular state in the nation, third or fourth, is able to get accurate results from 99.6% of the precincts in by, they close the polls at 8 o'clock because of the Panhandle being in Central Time, but generally by 9 o'clock, this gigantic, enormous state has got the results in. The results in are accurate and they are timely. I suppose it's not lost on people that this era of not knowing who the president is the night of Election Day in the modern era began back in 2000 when, of course, there was that razor-thin margin for George W. Bush. The Democrats decided to recount and recount and recount until they finally had a big enough number. Finally, the Supreme Court said you don't get to recount until you reach a number you like and then stop. Have your electors in by this date, and Bush won Florida by 500 votes.
They told Florida was to follow their own laws.
That's right. Yeah. They made them follow their own laws.
Decision.
That's exactly right. Oh, the court decided. No, the court said have your electors in Washington on this date, and that's why Bush won. But it was a razor-thin margin. It seems to me like the state of Florida, which, if you were old enough to remember that, was a laughingstock in the country. Hanging chads, dimpled chads, guys with magnifying glasses trying to determine the intent of some voter on a butterfly ballot. Florida shows us that we can have our election results in with accuracy and confidence, certainly within 2 hours after the polls close in this digitized age. But we have gotten to the point where we no longer expect this. Not going to open this entire can of worms other than to make one simple declarative sentence, and that is the 2020 election was suspicious to me because the 5 battleground states stopped counting for the night. That had never happened before. Now, in 2024, there was a moment when I actually had, the only time during the whole night when I was actually had my blood run cold, was when somebody made an announcement that said, we may not know the results of the election for several days, if not weeks. This is not an unreasonable request, is it, Steve? Especially with the trends towards early voting and mail-in voting. You would think that those votes could be tabulated relatively quickly, and you could have an answer on election night rather than having Arizona wait 2 weeks to let you know who won Maricopa County.
Oh, Maricopa County, yeah. Here's the thing. I'm not here to relitigate 2020 or 2000 Florida either, but I do want to say this because the fundamental issue is the difference between shame and shamelessness. Florida was ashamed about what happened in 2000, about their inability to determine who won, because even a recount doesn't take as long as they did, not a fair one. And Jeb Bush, who I've made a lot of fun of over the years, because easy target, he was governor, and he said, "We're not doing this again. This is awful. We're a laughingstock." I think that's the word you used, Bill. And he cleaned up and fixed Florida's voting process, or their vote counting process, and since 2004 on, they've had their numbers. And I remember a lot of us were sitting on the edge of our seat waiting for Florida. Oh, God, it's going to be another 2000. When it was Bush versus Kerry just 4 years later, and no, they had their numbers in fast, on time, and it's run like a well-oiled machine ever since. And whether the winner was, Barack Obama in 2008 or Donald Trump in 2024, I trust Florida's numbers.
I do too.
Because they've worked hard to make those numbers trustworthy, because they were ashamed of what happened in 2000. Let's go to your state, California, just last month, or in November, I should say, and they are shameless. One of the reasons that there is a one Republican majority in the House is because California spent weeks counting the vote until they flipped 4 GOP seats.
And we let it happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and they did it in broad daylight. It's the difference between shame and shamelessness. Now, constitutionally, I don't think the federal government has the authority to tell states how they can run their elections. But there are a few things we can do. One is we need to clean up, voting season. It needs to be election day, and I'd even be willing to compromise. If it really is a hassle for a lot of people, let's make it a 3-day process. Let's start on Sunday, finish on Tuesday, and make Tuesday a holiday. We invented this stuff.
Election day holiday without question that's easy.
We're America. We invented this. Let's celebrate it. Let's take the day off. Well, I write about this stuff. I don't get to take the day off, and same with you guys. That said, Congress gets to determine its own membership, right? It's a little known feature of the Constitution. So they can make rules such as any votes counted after 10 p.m. on Election day don't count. We aren't accepting those.
Simple.
And you better
when the
believe,
polls close, the polls are closed. Period.
Yeah, you better believe even California and Maricopa County will shape up because there is no excuse for this country that invented this stuff, the shining city on the hill, the beacon of hope, all of this to be a laughing stock for the rest of the world. Argentina counts their votes that day. France does it. Everybody does it but us. We should be setting the example, and President-elect Trump, President-re-elect Trump is absolutely correct in making this demand, and let's hope that Congress follows through on this.
Well, Scott, President Trump has made one of many campaign promises that election reform is going to be high on the list of things. I think that would be good for all Americans. We're all on the same page in terms of the constitutional structure of the United States and the idea that you put as little power in the federal government as you possibly can, push the rest of the necessary power down to the states and then down to the counties and down to the people and so on. But do you think there's a case to be made for a federal election standard, and do you think that is something that is something that should be a goal, or we all maintain that pushing power down to the states is theoretically great, but I don't have any confidence in electronic voting machines, just anecdotally and just in general, because there's no paper trail, there's no paper receipt. My entire point with my setup, Scott, was that in the pre-computer era, throughout the 20th century, using little black circles on little cards gets you a result very, very quickly, very, very accurately. The recount is right there. It's all something that somebody can tally, and the transparency is high. Do you think that we should have it at the very least as an ideal, a national election standard, or do you think that we should just leave it the way it is, where every state gets to decide how they're going to count and how long they want to take to count?
This is a tough question to answer, really, because I, like you, want to keep as much power in the hands of local authorities. And even though we are euphemistically referring to states here, it isn't states where the counting happens. It happens at the county level. And so
see, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So you're telling me that different counties can have different.
So yeah, every county has to count the ballots in there. So like I ran for office in Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. And in one election, it was pretty close, and I requested a recount, and I got to watch that. So that was a couple of days after the election. I forget exactly when. But I actually sat in a room with these people that they went through precinct by precinct and did a recount of the votes. It only took a couple of hours to do an entire recanvass of the entire county, which in that county's case is about population about 300,000, but there aren't that many people who vote in elections. So here's the challenge: is that it's not whether the states should handle it or whether the federal government should handle it. It's really how do you work with all these different counties? Pennsylvania alone had 67 counties. Texas has like 260 something. And so how do you deal with all of those? And I think, even though I have no personal opposition to electronic balloting, I don't think that that's really our problem. I think part of the challenge is that the reason why drawing dots on paper worked and computers have resulted in some issues over time is two things. Number one, dots on paper didn't always work. Ballots were stolen and lost and stuff like that back then. But I think it's people get paper and pencil. They understand it. I don't mean the voters. I mean the employees at the county election office. And it's like I worked for a school district once where they did a bond issue and they bought computers for every classroom. A lot of those computers essentially did nothing because the teachers were not ready for the computers in every classroom. They just didn't even know what to do with them, because they had been printing out things and mimeographing things and Xeroxing things and, and driving holes in paper with paper punches and stuff like that for all this time. So I think we still have a lot of people working at the county level in some areas who struggle to be able to manage the technology. Plus, they're working with third-party contractors who maintain and sell them the machines to do that. So, that's one complicating factor. And it's not like when we think of Florida, we say, oh, wow, they got this massive number of votes counted in just a couple of hours. Except in the big cities, it's really not like that. It's a bunch of different places that got their relatively small number of votes counted in a couple of hours, which means it can be done. And it can be done anywhere. I am not in favor of the federal government taking over the process. I would be in favor of kind of a best practices study that says, okay, where's it going well? Who's doing it effectively, accurately, rapidly? And then disperse that information to the other counties. A lot of those counties are going to want to be among the best practices people, so you won't have to, wave the stick at them or even dangle a carrot before them. If they don't jump right in, then you may have to do some of that stuff and provide incentives. But I think most county employees who are working with their elections board want to do a good job because they don't want to be the ones who are called out in public to say, hey, wait a minute, how'd you get that count wrong? Even if they have a political bent, they don't want to be on the other end of public criticism. They want to keep their heads down, work their 30 years, get their pension, and get out of there.
Well, one of the big things that just drives me absolutely nuts, especially in this last election cycle, is this constant reference to our country as our democracy. This is good for our democracy. It's going to save our democracy. It's going to be bad for our democracy. We don't live in a democracy. Democracies have got a lot of problems. We live in a republic, and we elect our officials through the democratic process, but we live in a republic. And I think the example of electronic voting machines is an interesting one for me. I try to be I almost said open-minded, but a really better term for me is intellectually honest. I am perfectly willing to admit that electronic voting machines might in fact have perfect integrity and be immune to cheating. I'm perfectly willing to admit that could be the case. But the bottom line is I don't trust them. And I don't trust them because they are not tangible. And I'm not the only person in the country who doesn't trust them. The important point to recognize here is that in a republic, the people that lose elections have to willingly submit to the people that win elections. And the only way that we can do that psychologically is to believe that we won or lost fairly. And so my point is that it's the perception that counts. And the reason I opened this up by saying that we counted votes and had the votes 2 hours during the entire 20th century is because the actual act of counting votes is perhaps the simplest mechanical thing that we can do with large numbers. This is not super equations that have to be run by quantum computers. This is something that a mechanical counter does very well. The same kind of thing that counts dollar bills in a bank can count these votes very effectively. So if it means going backwards to paper and blacked out circles in order to restore confidence so that we can say we lost this election, now we have to deal with 4 years of Kamala Harris, but we lost the election, so that's fair. I'm okay with that. When you start getting into assurances and when you start getting into machines that default to certain things or this machine is broken or all of the excuses we've heard with all the irregularities in the last 10 or 15 years, then I think that it's time for us to take a look at going back to something that worked very, very well for a very long time. And by the way, this doesn't just apply to Republicans. I noticed that this election, I think it was on, it certainly was on Independent, Steve. I don't know if it was your story or not, but this was the first time in a century that Democrats have not contested a Republican win.
Wow.
The first time in a century that Democrats have not contested a Republican win. So maybe the January 6th political prisoners who've been held there for 4 years now, maybe they actually accomplished something. By the Democrats being the party now of peaceful transfer of power, that's their brand, that's their shining consolation prize. This is the first time that they have not contested a Republican presidency in 100 years. So now that they put themselves in that box, let's keep them in it. Now let's have a system that we can all believe in. And every time you hear people say that any election modification that is designed to reduce cheating is going to be opposed by people, and the people that are opposing something like voter ID, voter registration, all of those things, we need to call them out in very simple rhetorical terms. What you're proposing makes it easier to cheat. Why does your side need to make it easier to cheat? That's the way we need to be handling these things in the future. For Steve Green and Scott Ott, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time right here on Right Angle.